Hey guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Now, as you can see, I'm in the nature trail today. Now, there have been some very serious reports of bear sightings in the woods. So, my buddy Jeff dressed up like a bear and we're gonna scare some hikers.
Hey Mom, I'm a bear. Rawr.
So we put some cameras all in the trees. Jeff, are you ready?
Yeah, man, I'm ready.
He's ready. It's gonna work. We got this. YouTube.
I got a kid on my back. I'm sorry.
Jeffrey Elliott Reed, is that you? Does your mother know you're out here?
Get a job, man.
Now, what was your degree in?
Liberal arts.
Liberal. Oh, that's real useful.
Oh, wait, it was just a prank. It was just a prank.
No!
That's what I'm talking about.
You take care. I'm gonna go right home and tell your
Have a
mama.
good day. Do not post that.
Hey, can I have some of your water?
Ricky, we got it. We're going viral. Yeah. Jeff, focus. Oh, we're gonna go so viral. Oh, here's someone coming. Jeff, get ready, get ready. Jeff, get ready.
Dude, I'm ready.
Wait, if you're, then who is?
What? Oh my gosh, run!
You get the camera. I'm not getting the camera. You get the camera. Are you crazy? You get the camera. Yeah, it's a bear. I don't care. It's coming. It's coming.
Do you remember the very first time that you were literally scared to death? Do you remember that? I hate to take you back to that moment. For those of you who go to church, maybe it was the first time you realized that your parents were driving on I-85 on Friday afternoon. That could be the first moment. Maybe at one of our partner churches, maybe for you, like that first memory of being scared to death was when you were at the mall and you looked up and you couldn't find your mom or your dad. You remember that feeling? Or maybe you were at Walmart, which is always scared to death, and you couldn't find what you were looking for, and there was no one to ask for help. Remember that moment? Maybe for those of you here at Woodstock, you remember like that first moment you were scared to death? Maybe it was like me. The very first memory I have of truly being terrified, of being scared to death, was the very first time I went on a camp out. It's the very first time I'd ever been out in the woods, kind of alone, especially at night. And to kind of make it worse, I was a camper at a camp. I was at this overnight camp, and spending the night in an overnight camp wasn't, that new to me. I mean, I had spent the night away from home before, but this was different. I was 10 years old, and it was the first time I'd been away for that length of time. It was a 2-week sleepover camp. So for 2 weeks, I was gonna be away from home, spending the night kind of on my own. It kind of made me a little nervous. The first day we got there, they dropped me off. I remember it's raining. I remember a lot about this. It's raining. I remember I went to meet my counselor. There were 6 of us in this cabin, this dorm room cabin, and I went and met my counselor, and the guy was massive. He was probably, I mean, in my memory, he was 7'4", but I was 10. So maybe he was 6'3", I don't know. Huge guy. He looked like he ate people like me for breakfast. I mean, the guy was that massive guy. And then he introduces himself and he says, "Hey, people call me Killer." And I thought, Mom, don't leave me here at this camp, right? So I met Killer. It turns out he was just a giant teddy bear. It wasn't that big a deal. But we were all excited about the first day of camp. We played basketball, a lot of sports the first day, but we were all looking forward to night 4, because night 4 of camp, we all went on camp out. And we were really excited about camp out, because at camp out, we were gonna have s'mores, unlimited chocolate. It was just gonna be fantastic. So we're all looking forward to camp out. And so, the first few days rolled by, and I noticed a couple of times the counselors would kind of go off on their own, maybe at meals. And there was one time we were all kind of playing a game and they all were gathered. And one of my friends said he overheard him talking about that there had been some like animal sightings in and around the camp. We were kind of in the foothills of North Georgia. And they said, I don't think it's a big deal, but we should just be aware when we go camping. And then later I heard a similar conversation like that. And it was in passing, and the counselors were talking. I just happened to walk by, but I slowed down because I heard something about a bear and I wasn't sure what they were talking about. And so then I kept going, and so of course the camp out night rolls around, and in the back of our minds, the campers have been talking, and they're like, "Hey, I heard that there's, some animals around, and we don't know how serious it is because the counselors keep kind of talking about it without us, but surely it's nothing to fear. They wouldn't take us out here if there were something to be afraid of, right?" So we go camping. It starts out great. We kind of march through the area. We go over a few hills. We found this beautiful kind of clearing on the top of a little mountain hill area. We all go and gather wood. We're all boys at camp. Like the idea of building fires, it was incredible. So we had like 50 fires that we built that night. We all built our fires. We ate hobo dinners for dinner. I don't know if you've ever had a hobo dinner. Super politically incorrect, but just forget that part. A hobo dinner is basically when you take tinfoil and you put as much meat in it as you can with some steak sauce and like one piece of broccoli. And then because you have to have at least one veggie, and then you fold it up and you cook it in the coals of the fire. It's delicious. Like inevitably, when you put it in or take it off, the tinfoil rips. And so it's like this beautiful combination of A1 and charred bark, and it's really good. And so we had the hobo meal, it was good. Then we got to s'mores, super stoked about the s'mores. We ate s'mores. If you're 10 years old on a camp out eating s'mores, you know how this goes. We're covered in marshmallow, really sticky. Our face has like pine straw and leaves attached to it. You can't get it off your hands, but you don't care because you're going back for more because you're 10, right? So the camp out's amazing. It's going so great. And then about 10 o'clock or so, the counselors say, hey, we probably should start kind of getting towards bed. And so some kids had tents, a few kids brought hammocks, and I just wanted to sleep under the open stars. And so me and my friend had a tarp. So we just put a tarp on the ground and put our sleeping bags on the tarp. We're pretty excited about this. And so we're all talking, we're laying there, and I don't know how much time went by, maybe 20 or 30 minutes probably. And my friend said, hey, did you hear that? And I'm like, what? And he goes, I feel like I heard something. And I'm like, well, we're in the woods. There's a lot of things out here to hear. There's crickets, I'm sure it's fine, And then a few minutes later, another kid comes over. He goes, hey, I feel like I just heard something. And I'm like, oh man, you too? And I'm like, I don't think it's anything, but then I'm getting a little nervous, right? Well, a few minutes goes by, and then I hear something. And there's like this roar, but it's really faint. I can't really hear it. It's pretty far in the distance. But I heard it. And so we went and got one of the counselors, and we're like, hey, we don't know that we should be afraid, but we feel like we heard something in the woods. And he goes, oh, I'm sure it's nothing. It's wind or whatever. And literally, as we're talking, we hear it again. And it's way closer this time. And the counselor goes, oh, wait, I just heard that too. And he's panicked. Like he looks scared. He's trying to be calm on the outside, right? But we're 10, he's like 19. We think he's like an old adult. Like he's 19. We assume 50 and 19 are the same thing, right? Like he should be able to handle this problem. But he looks kind of panicked too. So then he goes and he gets the rest of the counselors and they start talking. Well, as they're talking, we hear it again. And it's been moving and it's loud. It's definitely something. So the counselors are getting really nervous. They gather all of us campers together and they move us all to the center of the campsite and they put us by the fire and they're trying to be calm. And they say, hey, we feel like there may be like an animal out there. It's probably just a wild dog or maybe a squirrel. Don't worry about it. Because I think they're trying to be brave, right? And they go, it's probably nothing to worry about, but animals are, for the most part, scared of fire, and they're always more scared of you than you are of them. And I'm like, that doesn't help right now, but thank you. And so they say, you guys stay by the fire. We're gonna hang out here with you, but a couple of the counselors are gonna go kind of scare it off, go see what it is. And so these two counselors go off, and we see them with their flashlights, right? It's pitch dark, it's like 11:30. They're walking out, talking, and they're going, ah, and yelling, trying to scare the bear off, right? And we see their little flashlights bouncing off in the distance. Well, we are terrified. Like we're sitting by the fire and it's just all we can do not to, pee in our pants, which happened later. So the counselors go, these two counselors go, and we hear them yelling and talking, and then it gets quiet for about a minute. And I'm telling you, after about a minute of silence, all we hear is roar, the super loud roar. One of the flashlights falls on the ground, which we can see. The other flashlight starts going up and down. And this guy is sprinting back to the camp. He gets back to the camp and he's just by himself. Mark has been left out in the woods, his friend. We are all yelling, like we are screaming. We're 10, we are terrified. All the counselors are screaming, where's Mark? And the other guy goes, the bear got him. And I don't know why you're laughing. We weren't laughing. He says, the bear got Mark. And the counselor's like, well, what do we do? And they're like, I don't know. And then the counselors go, well, we gotta go help. And they all look at us and they go, you stay here, we're going to help find Mark. And I'm like, what? Like, you're the adult here, you have to stay with us. And so all the counselors leave us to go find Mark, who we think is dead. He's being eaten by a bear. They all go to find Mark and we're sitting there by the fire. And we are freaking out. freaking out. Now, I should tell you at this point in the story, this is all a hoax. The whole thing is a joke. For days, the counselors have been planning this elaborate stunt. They've been having conversations on the side, and when a camper walked by, they went, hey, I hear there's bears right now, we need to be careful. The whole thing is being set up for days. When we get out there at 10:30, one of the counselors sneaks off with a big bear call and starts through the campsite. And so for hours, they're all pulling this prank. I'm telling you, at 1 o'clock in the morning, it is still going strong. We're all sitting by the fire. I mean, the therapy bills are mounting. We're all sitting by the fire. Everybody is so scared. We're all crying. I mean, no one knows what to do. The counselors, I mean, it's like they've been rehearsing. They're running in one at a time. At one point, they had fake blood on. And they ran in and they go, somebody, I'm in shock, put my feet up. And we're like, okay. And I'm like, I don't even know that you do that for shock. We don't know, but we're 10, we're not nurses. So we're just trying to survive, you know? To say that we were scared to death is an understatement. We were terrified. So about 3 a.m., the bear mysteriously leaves the campsite because the counselors ran out of energy, we think. And they all gather back up. The counselor who's missing is back. We're all so grateful he's not dead. And he seems pretty okay, ironically. And he says, hey, by the way, you guys can all go to bed now. We're gonna go to sleep. We think the bear's gone. You're probably safe. So they all went to their tents. And the next morning, the counselors woke up. Every single one of these campers, all 50 of us, were still sitting by the campfire. And we had built this fire into a bonfire. Like, we could have burnt the woods down, because we're thinking if that bear comes back, a 20-foot flame will surely turn him away. So we didn't move. The next morning when they came back, they're like, what are you guys doing? We're like, were you kidding me? Like, we're sitting in our puddles of urine because the bear may come back. And so they started telling us it was just a joke. And we're like, no, it wasn't. It was a real bear. They're like, no, we were just playing. It was just a joke. And one kid goes, no, man, I saw it. Like, I saw the bear. And they're like, you didn't see the bear, right? In fact, it was such a joke, like we didn't believe them. We're trying to eat our Pop-Tarts and we're so scared, right? At breakfast, they had to show us how they did it. Actually, we brought a bear call. This is actually what they created for us. So they created a bear call. Have you ever seen one of these before? It's pretty incredible. If you want to scare some kids at Halloween, you can make one of these. Just get a big bucket and you get a string, and here's all they really do. They're out roaming the campsite like this. Isn't that incredible? And it works. Look at that. You look like a Teddy Graham. I'm not scared of you. Yeah, isn't that nuts? All right, now, that was the first time. That was the first time I was scared to death. Unfortunately, it wasn't the last time. And I bet you feel the same way. I mean, you've been scared to death before, and maybe it was about something silly, but our childhood fears have a way of kind of growing into, adult-size fears, and they're a little bit more difficult to deal with, aren't they? I mean, you remember when you were a kid and your mom would say, hey, there's nothing to be afraid of. But you would wake up during the night, maybe you had a bad dream, or that thing that lived in your closet that only came out at night came out. Or maybe your arm accidentally dropped off the side of your bed while you were sleeping, and that thing that lived under your bed came to get it, and you were scared. And your mom would come running in, and she would say, it's okay, honey, there's nothing to be afraid of. And when it came to your closet, maybe she was right, but the reality is that your mom just lied to you, because there's a lot to be afraid of. And when fear begins to kind of settle in our hearts and it blossoms into worry and anxiety, it really begins to destroy our life. When we begin to live with fear and we begin to live in a chronic state of fear, it can be completely debilitating. FDR, I think, got it right when he said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that is right on so many levels. Because when you are living in fear, you should be afraid. But you should be mostly afraid of the fear that you're living with. Because fear in our life can be completely incapacitating. Fear can paralyze us. It can cause us to not be able to move forward, backwards, or sideways. Fear can control us. It can cause you to become controlling as you try to manage your fear and control everybody and everything around you. Fear can literally kill you. Fear weakens your immune system. Fear begins to create psychological and mental problems. I mean, fear literally begins to destroy your brain. It eats you alive from the inside out. And so from time to time, we see people kind of dealing with fear like we do, but then every once in a while, we catch a glimpse of someone who is facing fear, but it's almost like they're impervious to fear. You know how like little kids can jump in a freezing pool and it doesn't faze them at all? They're impervious to the cold, and you're an adult and you're like, oh, no thank you, ocean, right? We see people who are like that with fear, and they just jump right in, and we see what they're walking through, and we're scared for them, and they're not even scared at all. And I don't mean the people who, get on four-wheelers and do quad backflips. I mean, that's not courageous, that's just nuts. Not that kind of fearlessness. The kind of people who look just like you, who act just like you, but they're just not afraid the way that we are. And when we open up the Bible, we see an incredible example of this, and it's actually in the disciples, the apostles. Luke, in the book of Acts, kind of writes about the beginnings of the church. And in the first centuries, this church is launching and really getting some steam behind it. The disciples, these apostles, had a lot to be afraid of, yet they seem to be completely fearless. They seem to be so incredibly bold. And they're always being arrested. They're always being falsely accused and tried. They're always being beaten and threatened to be killed. Yet they are just so fearless. Can I just show you one example of this? This is in Acts chapter 5. Here's kind of how it starts. They're standing before the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, and they're on trial again. And it's Peter, who you may have heard of, the apostle Peter. I mean, we name churches after this guy, right? He's so fearless. You've named kids after this. He's so fearless, right? So they're standing before these guys, and here's what happens. We gave you, the Pharisees speaking to these apostles, we gave you strict orders not to teach in his name, he said, yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty for this man's blood. I mean, this is like fear 101. You should be scared of these guys. These are the exact same people who just a few months prior arrested Jesus, accused him falsely, and crucified him. And now Peter and a few of the other guys are standing in front of the same people who hold their life in their hands. So Peter decides to respond to these guys. And you would think he would say, my bad, I won't do it again. That's what we would do. That's what people who are afraid do. But look what Peter does. Peter and the other apostles replied, we must obey God rather than human beings. The God of our ancestors raised Jesus from the dead, whom you killed, don't forget, whom you killed by hanging him on a cross. God exalted him to his own right hand as Prince and Savior, that he might bring Israel to repentance and forgive their sins. We are witnesses of these things, and so is the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him. And if they had Twitter back then, it was like hashtag boom roasted. Like fearless. Well, when the Pharisees heard that little speech, they weren't too pleased. When they heard that, they were furious and they wanted to put them to death. And one of the Pharisees stands up and he says, hold on, wait, let's go talk. And so they kind of hang out and talk and have a conversation about it. And they come back after the conversation and they decide instead of killing them, they're just gonna beat them for a while and let them go and threaten them. If you do it again, you will die. So he gives this speech, and here's kind of what happens. His speech persuaded them. They called the apostles in and they had them flogged, which is even worse than being beat up. Then they ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and they let them go. Now again, put yourself in their sandals for a minute. What would you do? You've just been beaten within an inch of your life, and you were told if you do it again, you should be afraid because we will kill you like we killed your leader. Remember that? You're next. Don't do it again. What do you think they did? Day after day, in the temple courts and from the house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. It's just incredible. Like instead of being scared to death, they're not even scared of death. It's like these apostles kind of channeled their inner FDR, right? It's like the only thing we have to fear is nothing. Nothing. We're not afraid of anything. It's just incredible. Now here's the thing. If these guys can live that way, I wonder if we can. Like, how do we do that? And the good news is that before we give them too much credit, they're not as great as we think. In fact, if you kind of look back at the stories that we see from Matthew, Matthew was one of these guys. And he wrote an account of the life of Jesus, which also means he wrote an account of what it looked like to be a disciple with Jesus. And they weren't always so brave, and they weren't always so fearless. In fact, we see one of those in a boat ride that they have with Jesus. Here, this is so fascinating. Matthew tells us about this. He says, then he got into the boat, talking about Jesus. Then Jesus got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. Now, hold on. If you're in the bottom of a boat and a huge storm blows up to the point where the waves are coming over the boat, are you gonna be sleeping in the bottom of the boat? Come on, right? Like, I wonder if he was really asleep. Like, I think Jesus may have been like fake sleeping, like I did every Sunday morning as a child, trying to get out of going to church when I was a kid. Like, maybe he was doing that, or maybe the storm wasn't as bad as Matthew made it out to be. But Matthew's writing this down for us, and maybe in his memory, this storm was like the fake real bear who almost killed me that night. Like, to Matthew, this was a terrifying moment, and the disciples are freaking out. So the disciples, they go down and they wake him up, and they say to Jesus, Lord, save us, we're going to drown, like AKA, we're terrified. This is the opposite of what they're doing in the book of Acts. It's the opposite of what we see in them later. It's like their FDR moment has totally changed. Just like the only thing we have to fear is everything. We're scared of everything. We're just petrified. We're scared of the waves. We're scared of the storm. And by the way, most of us are fishermen. So this isn't the first time we've been on a boat. It's not our first rodeo, but man, we are scared. Jesus replies, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up and he rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. And Jesus began to teach him a lesson, but do you think they caught on? Not even close. In fact, we see it again in another boat ride that they have. This is so fascinating. Next part, immediately, this is from Matthew again. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get onto the boat and go out ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And I think the disciples were like, oh shoot, not another boat moment, right? And so they get on the boat. Now, it continues. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. This has been a really long day for Jesus and really for the disciples. I mean, that morning he finds out that really one of his closest friends has been killed because of faith. They spent some time preaching and teaching to thousands and thousands of people. You may remember the story. It's where Jesus feeds 5,000, but they counted back then the men, so it was probably 15 or 20,000 people that they fed with just some fish and chips, and the disciples participated in that. And so like thousands of people have been fed. Jesus is a little tired probably, and so he sends the disciples out on the boat. He says, I'll come catch up with you later. I'm gonna go up here by myself and pray. Well, he goes up there and he spends a lot of time. And while he's up there, the boat, again, a storm kind of blows up. The wind is pushing the boat away from the shore. They try to get back to the shore to wait for Jesus and they can't. So now they're out there by themselves without Jesus, and the wind has shoved them out there. And then we pick up the story where Jesus decides to go and join them. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. Now, that is terrifying. Okay, if you see somebody walking on the lake, you should be scared. You know why? Anytime you see something that should not happen, it's scary. For instance, if this stool behind me started moving across the stage on its own, we should leave the building. That is scary. And the reason I know it's scary is because when I was a counselor at camp, that's how we scared the kids, and it worked every time, okay? When you see something that isn't supposed to be, it's scary. A person walking on the water, that's scary. Of course, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they cried, and they said, and they cried out in fear, which is totally normal. And then look how Jesus responds. But immediately, Jesus said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Jesus was constantly telling these guys, you don't have to be afraid. Don't be afraid, don't be afraid. And they would go, ooh, I don't wanna be afraid, but you're walking on the water. That's scary. I don't wanna be afraid, but everybody's threatening me. I don't wanna be afraid, but I'm not sure how I'm gonna pay for my meal next month. I don't wanna be afraid, but things are scary. The world is scary. And I'm trying to be courageous, and I'm trying to be brave. But you telling me not to be afraid isn't really helping. It's like telling me to stop breathing. I kinda don't have a choice. Well, they're doing their best. But then things actually get worse. You see, Jesus is falsely accused, and then he's arrested. And overnight, they have this false trial, and they bring false witnesses against the leader who's telling them not to be afraid, and now they're really afraid. And then the next morning, he's beaten, and he drags a beam up to the top of a hill called Golgotha. And they put nails in his hands and his feet, and for hours, he suffers on a cross, and then he dies. And the disciples go from being a little scared to absolutely terrified. You can't find them anywhere. They're behind locked doors because they know that they're next. In fact, Peter, the most bold of those disciples, the one who we see teaching and just letting those Pharisees have it in the book of Acts, is the most scared of all. He shows his face for a few minutes that night, and 3 different times people walk up to him and they go, wait, aren't you one of the guys who was with Jesus? And he's like, nah, man, I don't know who, Jehu, I don't know who that is. Two times it's middle school girls who walk up to him. They're like, hey, aren't you one of the ones? He's like, nah, I don't know who that is. The 3rd time somebody walks up, hey, aren't you Peter? I think I saw you with Jesus. And he goes, I don't know who the beep, beep, beep Jesus is. If you don't believe it, that's exactly what he said. You can read about it. In fact, if you're not a Christian, you should know, this guy's a saint now. Saint Peter. He kind of began as cursing Peter, okay? That's how scared he was. Claimed he never even saw the guy. And he went into hiding too. And it was a couple of really long days and a couple of really, really long nights. And on the morning of the 3rd day, something dramatic happened. Matthew tells us about that too. He says, after the Sabbath, at dawn, on the 1st day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb because the day before, 2 days before, men had taken Jesus off of the crucifix, off of the being nailed to the cross, and they wrapped his body and prepared it for burial, but they did a terrible job probably, and so the women are gonna go back to fix the problem because women should do all those things. And so they send the women back to fix it, and they show up, and instead of the Roman soldiers who were guarding it and the tomb being sealed, the stone is rolled away, the soldiers are nowhere to be found, and there's a person standing there who apparently is an angel. And the angel says to the women, do not be afraid. We've heard that before, right? Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he has risen just as he said he would. And I think they heard that and they wanted to process it, but it was hard not to be afraid because the world was a very, very scary place. Maybe the scariest it had ever been for them. And Jesus knew that. Suddenly Jesus met them. Of course he did. Greetings, he said. Can you imagine? They came to him and they clasped his feet and they worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. And for the very first time, I think people understood what he meant. Do not be afraid. Not because there's nothing scary, not because there's nothing to worry about, not because there's never a need for anxiety, no. Do not be afraid because you don't have to be afraid anymore. Don't be afraid because you don't have to be afraid anymore. See, for years, Jesus has been telling people that. Don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be scared, it's okay. You don't have to be afraid. And the disciples heard it over and over and over again. And they were trying so hard to be brave and they were trying so hard to be courageous. But bravery and courage is not the antidote to fear. The antidote to fear is faith. Did you know that in our Bibles, the command, do not be afraid, is the most repeated command? There's 366 of them in there, one for every day, plus one for a day that's extra scary. He's constantly telling us we don't have to be afraid, and we're constantly not wanting to be afraid, but it's just so hard. And we try to be brave and we try to be courageous, but those don't really lead us out of fear. They don't even really combat fear very well. But the disciples figured it out. Mary figured it out. You don't have to be afraid. Something dramatic has happened. You see, it's hard to be scared of death when you're not even scared of death. It's hard to be scared to death when you're not even scared of death. And the resurrection changed everything. The resurrection is what punctuated the command. Don't be afraid. See, as Jesus rose from the dead, all of those fears could be buried in that empty tomb. And the best news of all for us is that we all live on the other side or on the right side of the resurrection. Like the disciples lived on both sides of it. And on the bad side of the resurrection, there was a lot to be afraid of. And for 3 days, there was a lot to be terrified of. But on the other side of the resurrection, there just isn't anything left to be fearful of. There's nothing else to fear. Not that there isn't plenty of things to fear. I mean, the world is a scary place. There's a lot of things that we should be afraid of or that we can be afraid of. In fact, it's normal to be afraid. Like, it's normal to fear when danger is near. That's a normal thing to do. But here's what Jesus is saying, is that while it's normal to fear when danger is near, you don't have to fear when Jesus is near. You don't have to be afraid when Jesus is near. Just because the world is scary doesn't mean that we have to be scared. Just because there's things in our life that are scary doesn't mean we have to live in fear. There's really nothing to fear when Jesus is near. You know, when I think back to my time as a 10-year-old at camp, there's been a lot of therapy sessions for us since that night. And so funny, man. That night ended, everybody was so scared. We woke up and went back to our safe cabins. Well, the second week of camp, we had another camp out night. The first camp out night was required. The second camp out night was optional. I won't let you guess how many people went on the optional camp out night. There were 7 of us, me included. I remember we went out there, about 10:30, we started hearing something in the woods again. And the counselor comes running in. He was like, oh my gosh. He goes, we think that there's a crazy psycho person with a hatchet running around the campsite. And all 7 of us went, nah, we don't believe it. And then the counselor ran in, he was like, look, I've got the hatchet. And I remember saying at 10 years old, oh good, we don't have to be scared now because you have his hatchet, we're safe. And I remember the counselors being so disappointed that we weren't scared again. And I learned a lesson at 10. Sometimes you probably should be scared, but all fear can somewhat become irrational when there's nothing really to be afraid of. Let me ask you a question. What are you afraid of, really? What are you afraid of, really? I mean, if I said, what are you afraid of, you'd have an answer. I'm afraid of bears. I'm afraid of snakes. I'm afraid of public speaking. I'm afraid of spiders. I'm afraid that my marriage isn't gonna work. I'm afraid that I'm never gonna get married. I'm afraid that my job isn't gonna work. I'm afraid because I have bills. And those are good answers, but what is the deeper answer? What are you afraid of, really? Are you really afraid of losing your job? Or are you really afraid that if you lose your job, you won't have what you need to pay a mortgage? What are you really afraid of? Maybe it's a diagnosis. And it's easy to say, no, I'm afraid of cancer. I'm afraid. But what are you really afraid of? Are you afraid of cancer? Are you afraid of treatment? Or is it something deeper? Are you afraid of death? Are you afraid of leaving people who you love? Are you afraid that the people who you leave will be left? What are you really afraid of? It's easy to say, I'm afraid that I'm never gonna get married, and that's a real fear, but what are you really afraid of? Are you afraid that you'll never get married, or are you really afraid that you'll just feel alone? And are you really afraid that Jesus in that loneliness isn't enough? You see, if you're not sure what you're afraid of, the easy way to discover it is to just evaluate in your heart what you're most reluctant to give to Jesus. That's what you're really afraid of, because what you're afraid of is trusting Jesus, and faith and fear are directly connected. So what are you afraid of, really? And then on the heels of that question, let me ask you one more. How can faith begin to reframe your fear? How can that thing that you're afraid of, how can faith in something way more powerful than you begin to reframe what you're really scared of? You see, when it comes to this fight against fear, on our own, we're pretty powerless. Because let's just face it, the world is a scary place. There's a lot of things that we should probably be afraid of. But when Jesus is near, We don't have to fear because faith is the only antidote to fear. And Jesus is our greatest weapon to fight worry and anxiety and fear. And that's what Jesus wanted you to know. And that's what Jesus kept telling the disciples over and over and over again. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to fear. Not because the world isn't scary, but because I am here. And we're gonna pick that back up next week, and we're gonna make it a lot more practical. But over the next week, I would just love for all of us to consider what we're really afraid of, and how can faith begin to reframe how we see the world around us.